Okay, so in your kit, you should have this nice 6-panel folded piece. You can go ahead and smooth it out. The first thing we're going to work on for your techniques in watercolor is a wet on wet. So when I go in and I get my paints going, like if they're dry, I add in just a little bit of water and I gently, keeping it on the point but rubbing on the paint, add that water into the paint. So you can see in this vermilion green that I'm doing. The more it picks up, and then you can wipe it on the edge, you can see if it's getting nice and dark, which is what we want, then the darker it's going to be. This isn't a particularly dark color to start with. It's fairly light. I'm going to pick up some more when I run out. And I'm going to go ahead and add green all over. So I'm getting my paper wet, which is part of the wet on wet technique, right? A lot of people think you need to smooth out watercolors. If you don't, you get these beautiful patterns, which is what a lot of us like to leave who work with watercolor. I'm going to go and I'm going to pick up some blue to work on top of that green. So I'm using wet paint on top of what is still wet paint in here. And you can see it will naturally work its way into the other paints. Pick up a little bit of yellow to show you what a lighter color looks like on it. It even pushes away a bit of the paint that you already have on the surface of your canvas. You can watch, it'll blend a little bit, kind of like that. And then another technique we're going to talk about, well, this is still damp and you don't want it super shiny, but you want it wet, is you can drop some salt on it while it's still wet. And as you can see, the salt crystals get wet and they start to melt. And as they melt, they push that paint away from the surface. I'm going to bring this a little closer so you can see it, how those salt crystals are pushing it away. And then we'll take those salt crystals off once it's dry and we'll have a really nice little fun organic pattern on there. The next one we're going to look at is going to be wet on dry. I'm not going to paint right here because this edge is still wet. So we're going to skip over to this circle over here. And it's just like it sounds. You're going to put wet paint on a dry surface. So you'll notice when I paint with my watercolor brushes, I'm always pulling on the bristles. I don't ever push into the bristles. And that's because if you do that, it kinks them up here and they get tangled and then you never have a pointy brush again. So if you want to keep your brushes nice and pointed, you're always pulling those bristles, not pushing against them. If you like to use that technique, fine, buy your own paintbrush, do it with yours because it's going to ruin that paintbrush. Now, I don't always have to add more paint. If I want to move this paint out, if I want to turn this into a sphere, I can put just water on my brush. And that's how we get lighter colors in watercolor. We don't add white to them like you would with acrylics. You just thin out the watercolor and use up to plain water. And if your brush feels like it's getting too wet, you're dragging too much water around, dry it off. I always keep a towel nearby to dry off my brush. If you get an edge that you'd like to darken up while it's still wet, you can go back in and do tiny little dots along that edge. And you'll see it darkens up that edge a lot. And it will pull it up into that sphere where I want it to be a little bit more naturally. And the thinner I go and the more of the tip of my brush I get to, the less paint it puts onto there. So that is our wet onto dry technique when we're working with that. We're going to come back to this and do an overlay in a little bit. So we're going to let this dry some more. Now, because I didn't work right up to the edges, and the next technique we're going to look at is masking. We're going to go back over here to this one. So there's a few different ways to mask. There's what's called masking fluid, which looks like this. It's a colorless art masking fluid. It's white, which makes it really fun to see when you're trying to work with it on paper. And this paints on, or you can get special tools, pen-like tools to drip it on, but it dries like rubber cement or really rubbery, stretchy glue. So once everything's dried, you can take an eraser and erase it off and it peels right off the paper and it leaves it pristine white underneath. This runs anywhere between $10 and $30 a bottle. So for what we're doing at home, we're gonna be looking at using masking tape or painter's tape. So mine happens to be some painter's tape. I think I have masking tape in your kits, but it's all the same general idea. You're going to put down the tape and you're going to push it nice and firm. And this is fun because you can kind of make different patterns with the tape wherever you don't want your watercolors to go. If you have regular adhesive backed papers that you could peel off easily, this works very similarly to that, where you could put them on. As long as you can peel it back off the paper without ripping the paper when you're done, that is one of the key things that you want to look at. So for example, I could have this painted, and then I can go through and I can paint on top of where all that tape is, because the tape is keeping it from going to the rest of the paper. Now, watercolor paper is absorbent, so it might not be a super hard line when you do this. You might only end up with a softer line or a bit of a ragged line. It depends on the look you're going for and the strength of your tape that you're using. I'm going to add in some more of that wet on wet technique here, just to give it some interest when I'm working with it. Okay. So if that's sort of what I wanted to do, and then I let it dry, it's a little thick, so I'm going to go through and bop it with my paper towel, which also gives you some very interesting patterns, right? What you would do is you would let this dry before you peel it up, but because I need to move the paper, I'm going to go ahead and peel it up now. You want to be careful when you're doing it, again, that you're not ripping your paper. Kind of watch the angles of your tape and go those same angles while you're taking it off. And you can see it gives you a nice area left behind that didn't have anything. Now you don't have to leave it white. You could choose to go back in there and then paint those areas as well with some of that layering technique that's in there. So next thing we're gonna look at is lifting paint back off. And this is important if you get too much paint on the surface of your paper. And I'm going to do this with a really dark color. I have some fresh Payne's Gray in here, so I'm gonna pick that up with some water and show you an example of what that looks like to lift things back off. So if I painted this all on here, but I decided it wasn't quite as light as I wanted it, right? I can rinse my brush off, and then I'm going to dry my brush. Remember, very carefully patting it on to that paper towel. And then you can go through and drag your brush through it, and it acts like a sponge. It takes that paint up and back into your brush, so then you have to rinse the brush off again. You could do it with a wider brush for that same look. Of course, it never takes the paint off 100%. Once it's on the paper, some of it has already soaked in, but you can get this pretty light right away. You can also use a paper towel to go back in. Let's see if I can find a clean section. Right? And you can lift it back off with the paper towel by blotting it. And another thing you can still do when it's like this, if your paintbrush is damp but not dripping, you don't want it dripping but damp, you can also go through and you can add water. And when you add water, you can see that the water pushes away some of the paint as well. So now that we've looked at the different kinds of lifting, we're going to look at doing a little bit of splattering. Now, splattering gets messy. You have some control, but not a lot of control, because we're using a toothbrush to do this. You can use a whole brush, but for the smaller surfaces we're using, toothbrush works much better. If you want to protect the rest of your artwork, you're going to want to put some paper over it so that you're not getting it too wet. I like to get my toothbrush a little damp and then tap it off, and then pick up just a little bit of the paint. Not a whole lot. You just want it on the very tops of those bristles. And then you're going to use your thumb like this on it to make it splatter. So if you go like this, you're going to get some little splash marks like that. You're going to rinse this out the same way, except on the side in circles to get the paint out so it doesn't transfer to other areas. And then you could use it in any of your colors. I'm going to pick up some of the cerulean blue over here. I haven't used it yet, so I'm going to have to get a little wet. And then I can go back through and add those ones in. So the larger blops are pushing the bristles harder and letting more go. The finer ones are just doing the ends of it. So depending on what size bristle you want will depend on how far up the bristle. You want your dots, you want your bristles to get bigger dots, okay? My table's getting a little messy. I'm gonna go ahead and just dip my paper towel in there real quick and wipe up some of my table so it doesn't get on the back too much. Splatters are useful when you're doing things like fine rocks or sand type looks, leaves far away on trees. So that's where you can use some of that splattering technique. Then the last technique we're going to come back to in just a minute. Let's go check down here and see if any of these are dry. Now, you can do dry checks two different ways. You can look sideways and see if it still looks wet from the side, which this one down here still does. Or you can use the back of your hand and put it on top. If it still feels really cool to the touch, it's probably still damp. If it comes off on you, obviously it's still damp. This one's pretty dry. It's still a little wet, but not too much. So I'm going to go back. We'll pretend like this is fully dry. And because watercolors are transparent, you can layer them. So if I wanted to go back in and then add a layer of yellow on top of my blue, I could do that just like that. Now remember, it does re-wet the watercolor, so where you drag it through that blue, you're going to end up with some blue in that yellow by the time you get to the end of it. But you can see through this yellow to the blue that's underneath. It'll even turn it a little bit green. Again, because those watercolors are transparent. So I did it on that side. I could also try it over here on this side where I just drag it down like that. And again, you can still see through to the circle on the back side. So when you're painting with watercolors, keep that in mind. You can't put lighter colors on top of darker colors because you're always going to be able to see through them to the darker color underneath. So you can't really hide that darker color. But if you wanted to do a series of different layers back and forth to create a specific look, such as in trees, you can do that. And I always start my trees kind of with a yellow because that would be the lightest color of a leaf when you're working with trees. So I could say go through and add my yellow leaves in first, which are going to tend to be on tops of branches where the sun's shining on them. And then I'd go back and I'd start adding a green color. This one happens to be a vermilion green. My favorite green to use, which is more of a true green, would be what's called Hooker's green, named after Hooker, who created the color. Okay, so you're going to go back in there and you would add in. Again, we're working kind of the wet into wet technique on this. And I want to keep those colors vibrant because what we're going to do for this next part, you want to have some deep saturated colors in there. And then for the really shaded parts of my tree, I'm even going to go down to a blue. And this is something that you might have also learned in your drawing classes when working with color, is instead of going to Payne's gray or a black, you want to stick with actual colors for more interest and variety when you're working on things. So this would be my first layer in trees. And then one of the techniques that you can use to create more of that tree leafy look is you can take some plastic, like a plastic Ziploc bag or some saran wrap, any kind of plastic works. I'm going to tear this one off. I'm not going to need this anymore. And then what you would do is you would go in and you would crinkle it up, for me, for the leaves at least. Now you could do this directionally, right? So if I wanted directional lines in my paper, I could kind of fold it like a fan, sort of like that, and it would give it more lines as it dries. But I don't want lines, we're doing leaves, so I'm going to really crinkle it because I want that crinkled look to it, and I'm going to put it where I have painted. Now typically you just put a book flat on top of here and let it dry. You are welcome to do that as long as it can stay on your desk. I don't know if your iPad would be heavy enough, but that would be one option you could do. But the drying time takes about 24 hours. So find something you don't really need or move this to a spot first, then put your wrinkled plastic on top of it and let it sit for 24 hours. Because then when you pull it off, it'll have this really cool pattern in the background. Let me show that to you on another one. So here's one where I had put down a whole bunch of fresh leaves from trees, and then I put plastic wrap down on top of that and pressed it with a series of books. So you can see the leaves and the veins that showed up in it, and then behind it you can see where the plastic wrap had those lovely, beautiful designs where it held the paint or pushed the paint out of the way.